Hey, folks, welcome to another episode of the Bulwarg Disclosure Podcast. We've got a really exciting guest here tonight with us, author, musician, filmmaker, researcher, Nick Schreck. Welcome.
Now you've made it that I have to be exciting. So you've set a very high standard. I'm going to have to be extremely thrilling and sensational.
Yes.
How are
Well,
you
you
today?
you, you
Thank
kind
you
of
for
are
inviting me.
kind of a jack of all trades. I wasn't sure exactly what to introduce you as exactly, but I guess you're probably most well known for your writing and your research surrounding Charles Manson and the Tate Labianca murders.
Well, I mean, that is one level of what I do. It's certainly not the only thing I'm interested in. My primary work is musical, and that is the center of my work. I would say writing is secondary,
Okay.
and now filmmaking is coming up there as third.
And you mentioned off camera also that you some students that you work with. Is this in music or filmmaking? Is
No,
or
no,
something
I,
else?
I am a spiritual teacher as well, and I teach 3 times a week tantric Buddhism and magic to students all over the world. So
Okay.
Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Sundays are pretty much dedicated to teaching my students.
Is there any particular school of thought with the magic? Are we talking Kabbalah or
No, definitely not talking Kabbalah or anything to do with any Abrahamic demiurgic religion,
yeah?
because I am very firmly a Gnostic, and I
Mhm.
believe that Yahweh is Ial de both, a malevolent pretender god. So nothing to do with Abrahamic
Mhm.
religion whatsoever, except a Gnostic
Mhm.
understanding of that. Mostly from the point of view of Tantric Buddhism is the foundation of what I teach, but magic in general, which is, a very deep art form as much as a science.
And some people will be familiar with the fact that at one point you were a member of the Church of Satan, which to some people may sound contradictory to what you just said, but from what I understand about the Church of Satan's philosophy, it's not so much an Abrahamic view of it. It was more looking at Satan as kind of a figure and an
Well, let
archetype.
me let me make this very clear.
Yeah,
One, I
please.
was never a member of the Church of Satan. I was made an honorary member by Anton Lavey because of our secular friendship, and he made many musicians and media people honorary member in the hopes that we would publicize him.
Mhm.
I have absolutely no respect for Anton Lavey or the Church of Satan, and we broke with it in 1990 and have absolutely no regard whatsoever for him or the Satanic Bible or the Church of Satan. And in fact, I disagreed with his atheistic view in general, and I completely hold him and his followers in utter contempt. And that's been true for decades. And they have fought a smear campaign against Sina and I for decades.
Mhm.
So I have nothing good to say about Anton Lavey or the Church of Satan. My association with him lasted from February of 1988 to April of 1990. And yeah, I absolutely do not support the Church of Satan whatsoever or any form of Satanism.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
I should point out, when I was a Satanist, I was a literal devil worshiper. I did believe then, and I do believe now, that the devil is a truly existent being. The Satan is an actual being. I don't have anything to do with that anymore, and I have not for
Mhm.
decades.
Mhm.
But just as Yahweh is a real God, the devil is also a real being, but it isn't what people think it is. And
Yeah.
actually, in my newest version of the Satanic Screen, because of these misunderstandings, I get into that in great detail, the misunderstandings of what the Satan and the devil is. And in brief, I can say, which may surprise Christians and so called Satanists alike, the actual fact is the devil, the Satan, as it's called, is not a name, but a title, is not a fallen angel, is not Lucifer, is not the snake in the Garden of Eden, is not the being that falls from heaven, that say, how have you fallen from heaven, Lucifer? All of that is a misunderstanding and misinterpretation of the Bible. And in fact, briefly, without getting into great theological exhaustive detail, the Satan is a loyal assistant of Yahweh. He is not his opponent. And Christians or Satanists who think that the devil is the adversary to God or Yahweh are mistaken. He is his assistant who comes to earth to tempt followers of Yahweh, to test them, to make sure that they are loyal. So, as we see in the book of Job,
Right.
But of course, most Christians and Satanists haven't bothered to read the book from which this figure comes, so they wouldn't know that. But
Indeed.
just to, briefly, and I have given several lectures on this subject, one of them at the Wave Gothic Treffen last year, and you can find that online on my YouTube channel, the Nikolas Schreck channel, which is basically everything you know about Satan is wrong, which for the most part is true. So I just want to clarify that from the get-go.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I'm very interested in the history of religion and, the figure of Satan. It does seem like there's quite a bit of misinterpretation. You have the different traditions kind of speak about him or revere or fear him in these different ways. And can you kind of explain a little bit about where along the way it was that the history or the archetype of Satan or the fallen angel or whatever was bastardized and kind of changed? Was this the Roman Catholic Church? Where along the line did this kind of perverted idea of what he represents?
As I said, in the new version of the Satanic Screen, which you can get from Head Press in England, but is available in the United States, Europe, and everywhere from Head Press, in the introduction, because the figure of Satan and the devil has been so misunderstood, I went out of my way in the very introduction to explain it before I even get into the history of this figure in the cinema. To make a very, very long story short, what happened is the Catholic Church interpreted some of the biblical stories, the snake in the Garden of Eden, the fall of this Babylonian king, who is probably Nebuchadnezzar, has been characterized as Lucifer wrongly. There is no such being as Lucifer. In fact, as I pointed out before, Jesus is referred to as Lucifer, the shining one, in a hymn, in a Catholic hymn. There is even a Saint Lucifer. So it's a complete misnomer and a misunderstanding of translation. Basically, the Catholic Church, when it created the canon, the official version of the Christian religion that it put across, which I do not believe is the authentic teaching of Jesus Christ, they had to explain the question: if God is all powerful, how can there be evil? And the way they explained it is by taking this minor figure called Hasatan, the Satan, which is mentioned very vaguely and briefly in the Bible, in the book of Job, in the moment in which Christ confronts the Satan in the desert, when he begins to realize that he is the Son of God and he faces the temptation of the Satan. They took this minor figure and elevated him into this gigantic figure of malevolent evil that is in opposition to God. It was the Roman Catholic way of dealing with the philosophical issue of how can all-powerful, all-good God create evil. And so that's what happened, is they took this Old Testament minor Hebrew figure, the Satan, and elevated him into a kind of anti-God. Now, in United States, what I have called civic Christianity, which is largely a kind of political Christianity, as we see more and more with the plague of Christian nationalism that is infecting the United States in general, it then became just a blanket projection of human fears, of whatever anybody fears, it becomes called Satan. And, it has descended to the lowest level of QAnon fantasy, which has now brought about, honestly, a new satanic panic of the same kind that I dealt with in the 1980s. And actually, it's even worse. It has seeped into more levels of society. And as usual, I've been dragged into all these conspiracy theories about it. So,
yeah,
it's...
Sorry,
yeah.
Go ahead.
No, it's... as I point out too in the Satanic Screen, a lot of the misunderstandings about the devil come from extra biblical sources. They come from literary sources. They come from Dante's Inferno,
Mhm.
Goethe's Faust,
Mhm.
Milton, particularly Paradise
Paradise.
Lost.
Mhm.
These are literary interpretations of the devil that have entered folklore, but a lot of people don't realize they have no biblical basis. They are not found in scripture. And basically, Milton's idea in Paradise Lost, this kind of romantic, tragic anti hero, although he himself was a Christian, but the way that people interpreted that has led to the misunderstanding of the devil as this kind of romantic rebel and adversary against God, which he is absolutely not.
Mhm.
He's the devil is God's loyal assistant. That may
Mhm.
shock people to hear, but if you look at real biblical scholarship, that's the fact. And again, I accentuate, I know that that being is real. I have encountered it. I have worked with it wrongly, and I have corrected my own misinterpretations about it through spiritual work and scholarly
Mhm.
research.
Mhm. Can you tell us, I don't mind if you don't feel like sharing, but can you tell us a little bit about what led to kind of that change in your belief system?
Um, many factors. First of all, I think there's a very simplified cartoon idea of my spiritual progress is that, first of all, like you said, I was a member of the Church of Satan. That's what you have heard. I was not. I have always pursued all kinds of spiritual traditions. I began meditating when I was 13 years old in the Advaita tradition. I've always been interested in Eastern mysticism. I learned Zen meditation in the early 80s. For many years after I broke with any kind of occultism and Satanism, which was a long time ago, I followed the Vama Marga, or the Indian left-hand path, the worship of Shakti, Shaktism, and the veneration of Kali, which I still continue to venerate the goddess Kali as part of my spiritual work. And eventually I not only reject Satanism, I reject all of Western occultism in toto, all of it completely. It's just an eclectic patchwork quilt of nonsense that has been put together mostly by a series of con men and con women like Madame Blavatsky, the
Mhm.
Order of the Golden Dawn,
Mhm.
Aleister Crowley, and all of it. And actually, a student of mine actually pointed this out recently. Basically, Western occultism is a kind of pseudo Freemasonry. And I don't, and I'm sure some of your listeners believe Freemasonry holds the patent on the secrets of the Illuminati. I do not believe that, but I reject Western occultism in the words of the traditionalist philosopher Rene Guénon, called it counter-initiatory. In other words, it pretends to be initiatory, but it is actually a dead end.
And is it
So
by design, like a misdirection kind of thing?
no, I don't think it's deliberately by design. I think it's out of ignorance and maybe sincere misinformation, and also the Christian persecution of anything that was not Christian led Western esotericism to become an underground and almost criminal activity. And but I don't believe it has any legitimate lineage, and I don't believe it works. I don't believe it functions.
Mhm.
So over many years of studying many spiritual traditions, including the Grail, including Sufism, I ultimately decided in the early part of the 21st century, and I can explain exactly how that happened, to have nothing more to do with this do-it-yourself Western occultism in which somebody invents a new order or religion last Tuesday and then tries to present it as authoritative. And ultimately, I decided that Tantric Buddhism, Vajrayana, and I took refuge in Buddhism. A lot of people say I'm a Buddhist, but they haven't really converted to it and taken refuge in Buddhism. I have, and that's what I practice, and that's what I teach. So, I don't mean to proselytize or push what I believe on anyone else. I respect everyone's opinion to practice whatever religion or spiritual tradition they feel comfortable with. Personally, I believe that Vajrayana Tantric Buddhism is the absolute truth and the correct and proper way to liberation from this material world of suffering.
Mhm. Just for my own my own personal interest in clarifications. So from my
Uh-huh.
understanding, I've read most of the Typhonian trilogies by Kenneth Grant, and the Vama Marg, the left hand ped, the tantric boot or tantric kind of Eastern philosophy was very much his area of studies and expertise. And to my
Right,
understanding, one of the main, I guess you would say, deities that he venerated was Set or Shaitan, which
right,
is oftentimes identified, across traditionally as the same thing as, what the Abrahamic faiths refer to as Satan. Can
right.
you explain a little bit more about maybe how someone like Kenneth Grant or Tantric Buddhism would look at that figure? I know you said that Kali
Yeah.
is a deity that you venerate. Can you just explain a little bit?
Mhm.
Is it a
Yeah.
literal deity? Is it
On
an
a
archetypal thing?
Yeah, absolutely. On a personal level, I lived in England in 1983. I lived in London, and I got involved with some people that were involved with the Typhonian OTO of Kenneth Grant. In 1989, I corresponded with Kenneth Grant and spoke to him for an interview for a book which I've mentioned before called The Demonic Revolution, in which I interviewed almost every major occultist figure. That's how
Mhm.
I had the misfortune of meeting Anton Lavey, how I first contacted the other idiot, Michael Aquino. I dealt with all of the occult figures you can think of in the runic world, the Odinic world, the Wicca world, all of it. And that is ultimate, that book, actually, working on that book, seeing the petty backstabbing, feuding between all these groups and their basic mediocrity is what convinced me to reject occultism in general. But I had cordial relations with Kenneth Grant and corresponded with him. And what I wanted to say, in England in 1983, when I went there, I got involved with some magicians that were involved with the Typhonian OTO. And I was already interested in the god Set. And I found very quickly, obviously, you will see my theme of being a doubting Thomas and a skeptic, that Kenneth Grant's idea that Set and Shaitan or Satan are the same thing is absolutely not true. And I began going to the British Museum Library and studying Egyptology, looking at scholarly texts about Egyptology. So I want to make this crystal clear because I am a devotee of the god Set and have been for decades. Set has no connection whatsoever to the Abrahamic figure of Satan. Now that's a mistake that Kenneth Grant made, that Michael Aquino made, and it absolutely has no basis in fact. If we want to deal with fact, of course, we have long ago entered the world of what the great genius Kellyanne Conway called alternative facts, and I understand that emotion and opinion matters more than fact. So, but I'm one of the last crazy people who believe critical thinking can prove that there are actual facts that can be verified.
Mhm. Mhm.
So I want to make it clear, Satan is not Set. Those are two totally different figures. And secondly, Kenneth Grant had some kind of weird poetic, instinctive understanding that the left-hand path of Tantra, of the Vamamarga, is more connected to reality than Crowley's idea of it, which was very mistaken because Crowley's idea of the left-hand path was poisoned by Madame Blavatsky,
Mhm.
because Theosophy taught that the left-hand path is evil, black magic, the way of the devil, which is also not true. And I've given another lecture to make that clear. It's also on my YouTube channel,
Mhm.
explaining the left-hand path is actually the veneration of the feminine. It is not, it doesn't have anything to do with isolate intelligence or individualism or worshiping yourself or the devil.
Mhm.
Not if you want to look at the traditional spiritual tradition of Tantra. It has nothing to do with that. So I experimented as a young man with all of these occult traditions deeply. I looked into the Typhonian OTO. I rejected it, as I reject Thelema in its entirety as well. I think Aleister Crowley is one of the worst poster boys for magic there could be. He was not only an ineffectual magician, he was just wrong about many, many things. And,
Mhm.
and in the book that Zena and I wrote in the early 21st century, Demons of the Flesh, we have a chapter in which we explain why, we reject the Crowleyan ethos and Thelema. Does that answer your question, or did I digress too much?
No, absolutely, it does. And it's from the many different interpretations that there are out there of Crowley's work. It does seem like quite a general consensus of it is that a lot of it was so, that his ego and things like that kind of took away from any of the legitimacy that he had, especially later in life. I know that you even told me some off camera, some anecdotes about him and Kenneth Grant and their almost competition or rivalry kind of for this, for who's taking over kind of the crown of
I would
Western
say in
occultism.
general, and again, this gets back to the malign effect of Freemasonry with its degrees and its hierarchy, and you have to be a certain degree to know this information. Not that there isn't true initiation, not that there is not true levels of knowledge, but they are not conferred by this pageantry, this kind of theatrical mummery of degrees. And so this whole degree system leads to nothing but egotism, competition, and who is the biggest dog, who is an ipsissimus, who's a magus. All of that is absolutely not only useless, it is harmful to genuine initiation. And I understand that doesn't make sense to most people in the occult world who think that that's the heart of what initiation is about. Right. But true wisdom, true knowledge, true, absolute understanding of reality has nothing to do with degree systems. It cannot be conferred by another person. It cannot be granted by any organization. No pun intended with grant. But so I think it's important to clarify that. And I think there are sincere practitioners out there who could be salvaged from the poisonous dead end of Western occultism by looking at the true spiritual traditions.
You mentioned a couple figures of a few moments ago, obviously Lavey and then Michael Aquino, and, Bulwarg and our whole topics, range from political skepticism to, things that, for lack of a better word, would be called conspiracy theory. So both of those names obviously will ring a bell with lots of listeners and people who are interested in those types of things. And you also mentioned the Satanic Panic, which a lot of people are aware of, was originally this time during the 80s where there were these different scandalous events going on, many of them circling around child abuse or child trafficking or the allegations of that. So I wanted to get your take actually on, one of the main figures of that whole scene going on back then was a book put out by a guy named John DeCamp, The Franklin Scandal. And this had to do with essentially a prostitution ring that was going on in Omaha, Nebraska, and it ran from a small credit union run by a guy named Larry, I forget his name, Larry King, all the way up to, very high levels in Congress and in U.S. government. Now, from what I understand and from reading quite a few books on the topic, it does seem like there is quite a lot of legitimacy to the allegations involved in the Franklin Credit Union scandal. However, where the Satanic Panic and those events kind of start to veer off, it seems like, are in some of the other cases that were much more publicized and much more, a lot of shock value and things, specifically with the guy you mentioned, Michael Aquino, and his organization, the Temple of Set. Aquino was a high-ranking naval intelligence, or
no? That's I guess my job.
What branch of the government was he in?
Michael Aquino was not high-ranking anything. He was a lieutenant colonel.
Okay.
And anyone who comes from a military background will understand. Now, if you look at the internet, the cesspool of lies, disinformation, and bullshit, it's General Aquino who was, in the CIA. No, Michael Aquino, the real human being who I knew very well, unfortunately, was a lieutenant colonel in the Defense Intelligence Agency, which is not the CIA, which is the intelligence branch of the United States Army. He was not some psyops expert. He had nothing to do. He had no authority over mind control or all of the things he's been accused of. He was not involved with MK Ultra, which was a CIA operation, which also leads to unbelievable misunderstandings, and which I have researched thoroughly. He was in charge of logistics. He was in charge of things like financing. He was in charge of things like how much money should be appropriated for tanks. What the Defense Intelligence Agency was looking at was counterintelligence against the Soviet Union at the time that he was involved with the United States Army. He was involved in NASA as a military attaché to NASA. But largely he was a paper pusher who was involved in financing, and he did not have any kind of great authority in the Pentagon, nor was he particularly respected. And in fact, because of his what was seen as dangerous or goofy, depending on which side of the bread you're buttering, activities with the Temple of Set, the right-wing Republican Senator Jesse Helms actually pushed to get him pushed out of the Army. And he retired. I don't know if he retired willingly or was pushed out. Now, one of the things about Aquino, who I think a lot of people don't know, killed himself. He actually shot himself. And I don't think people realize that.
Not that long ago either, right?
No, I think it was 2019, but don't quote me on that. But first of all, no person of any kind of spiritual understanding would ever kill themselves. In my mind, that is a complete realization that this is not somebody who understands even the basics of the spiritual world.
Sure.
So, a genuine spiritual teacher or someone who even understands the metaphysical consequences of suicide would never kill themselves. And I think that has to be taken into account. As far as the allegations of child abuse and child molestation and the Presidio affair, and also this idea that he was involved with the kidnapping of some child, that's just, now he was an unethical person. He was a misinformed person who spread wrong ideas about the left-hand path, who spread wrong ideas about the God set that were more grounded in fantasy of 19th century literature and Star Wars and pop culture shit than actual reality. And I argued with him, have you even looked at Egyptian mythology? Do you even know the actual lore of the God set? And he did not, nor was he interested in it. So my quarrel with him it was on religious grounds and on ethical grounds, which I will get into in a memoir about my unfortunate misadventures in the satanic milieu, a book that I've been commissioned to write and which will come out in the future. I'll get into all the details of that. But as the main thing, and he's supposed to be this great psyops master of psychological warfare. The only thing he's known for and remembered for is these accusations of child molestation. So how good was he at being a Machiavellian master manipulator? I do not believe that he had anything to do with any kind of child molesting. I think these accusations, no, I don't like him. I'm not supporting him, but fair is fair. That's simply not true. And,
where those accusations originated from?
During the Satanic Panic, some Christian police and Christian officers at the Presidio Army base where he served looked at his bizarre appearance. They knew he was publicly connected to the Temple of Set, and they projected and they created a false narrative using the satanic ritual abuse psychology, which in itself was a kind of abuse done to children. They encouraged people to make false confessions. It's part of the American tradition, which I've said many times. The heart of America is the Salem witch trials. And that is still this Puritan looking for evil, looking for a scapegoat, looking for the devil. America began with Salem, and it's still under the spell of Salem, looking for witches and devils and all of that. And QAnon is a continuation of the same nonsense that was going on in the Satanic Panic. I've said in jest, but not entirely in jest, for Michael Aquino to have been a child molester, he would have had to have sex. So I got the impression of somebody who was a very unsexual being. He was basically a homebody who lived on the computer and had a kind of alter ego life through the internet, through chat groups, and constantly spent all of his time, writing this bilge on the internet. I would eat my hat proverbially if he had anything to do with any of these allegations. Now, saying that, I understand whenever I doubt any of these official conspiracy narratives that are so popular, people then accuse me of being part of the conspiracy to cover up the facts. And frankly, you just have to live with that because we are living in a new dark ages of ignorance. Like for instance, when I say that the process church of the final judgment was not involved in the Tate Labianca murders, that actually happened. The Tate murder happened today, on the day that we are recording this in 1969, on this date, August 8th, which is a very significant date historically and in my own career. When I say that the process church was not involved with it, then many people have said, oh, well, he must be in the process church and he's denying it because he's protecting their reputation. When I say that the CIA was not involved in Charles Manson and that he was not a MK Ultra stooge or experiment gone wrong, which is the idea of my erstwhile friend, who I totally disagree with now, Tom O'Neill, then people say, well, then Schreck must be working for the CIA so I understand actually we're living truly in a dark ages. So I do accept the futility of trying to argue reason against this kind of irrationality because we live in an age of runaway conspiracy theory madness where people go for their emotions rather than facts, as I've said in the earlier part of our conversation. But so I can't say absolutely, but I knew the man very well. I despise him. If I could say something worse about him, I would. I don't think he's guilty of those allegations, if we know.
Okay. Well, thanks for kind of expounding on that a little bit.
I think it's important to,
Yeah. And these are topics that are hotly debated still. And there's a lot of interest in these types of things, just, especially with some of the things that have come to light over the past, 5-10 years, things like the Jeffrey Epstein case and, lots of these things that harken back to other events that have happened in American history. And, you had a personal relationship with people like Aquino and Lavey. Right. So that was part of me wanting to talk to you.
I would say in general, conspiracy theorists, calm the fuck down. These were not powerful people. Mm-hmm. These were not people that had any kind of power or authority. Mm-hmm. And the problem is most of the people who fear these Illuminati, huge, gigantic, specter-like perfect conspiracies that work like clockwork have never dealt with anyone in power. They don't know anyone in the military. They don't know how inefficient and incompetent the United States Army is. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The United States Army hasn't won a war really since World War II. And even that was largely with the help of the Soviet Union. The idea that the United States Army has this kind of power, the idea that the Central Intelligence Agency, the main problem here is overestimating the competence, efficiency, and power of government bureaucrats. And I've encountered them, I've researched them, I've known them. They are not some superhuman Illuminati masterminds. They are bungling, inefficient human beings that could be working for the post office, mm-hmm. which of course I'm sure some people think the post office is a sinister plot too, So have
you read any Thomas Pynchon?
Oh yeah, yes.
One of the plots of his earlier books involved the post office being just that. So that's
the crying of Lot 49.
Yes, yeah.
No, I'm a great fan of Thomas Pynchon, and I would say if there's an influence on some of the novels that I've been working on, I would acknowledge Pynchon as definitely an influence. So yeah, I admire most of Pynchon's work. Yeah.
I agree with you. No, there is no human that is superhuman, but this is where me and you might have some disagreement, and I respect and I'm very interested in your opinion. But
Uh-huh.
just from, there seems to be a very big overlap, and just hear me out on this, but there seems to be a documentable overlap between some of the more fringe cults, oftentimes, occult centric or satanic cults, and intelligence agencies. Now, whether these people are, like we've discussed before, the difference between an asset and an agent, a willing participant or someone being taken advantage of. There are plenty of documented connections between some of these cults. If you read Timothy Wiley's autobiography, I think that he worked on himself. There's plenty of parts of that book where he talks about his prior work with MI6.
Mhm.
There is Scientology. L. Ron Hubbard was in the Navy. He claimed that the FBI had sent him to infiltrate the OTO. Even Anton Lavey, if you read the autobiography of him that was by, I think, his widow, Blanche Barteau, he talks about how early on in he worked, I guess, kind of running guns for Israel and Mossad. There's
Nonsense. It's
uh,
it's first of all, okay, that I was there when that book was being composed. Anton Lavey dictated it to the person called Blanche Barton.
mm-hmm.
Uh, with Lavey, I can tell you that's absolute nonsense.
Just
He wasn't
embellishments kind of to his life.
embellishments is a nice word for lie.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
He wasn't running guns for anything. He would like to have created this dangerous uh, reputation, and without getting into details about that. L. Ron Hubbard and LaVey were very similar. They were narcissistic, pathological liars. L. Ron Hubbard was in the Navy. I have researched his Navy career. He had no authority, no power. He was thrown out of the Navy for being insane, actually. And the other thing is, I'm sure you're familiar with the work of Dave McGowan.
I am.
And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of this idea that occultism and even rock music and a lot of counterculture and alternative thinking is steered by intelligence agencies or the military. I think Dave McGowan's book, Weird Scenes in Laurel Canyon, is responsible for a lot of this.
And I do understand that, especially during these times, everyone's relatives were in the military to some degree. And part of his thesis, is pointing out, like in Weird Scenes, he points out that almost all of these groups, these musicians, they had family members or were them.
I have to say, this is completely laughable.
No, I'm
Yeah,
kind of on your side here, saying that,
right.
during this time, there were many more people that were in the military during this time. So using that, saying that correlation
Well,
automatically means
the
it's
baby
not true.
boomers, that became the generation that became rock musicians.
Mm-hmm.
The baby boom existed because of this little thing called World War II,
Mm-hmm.
in which almost everybody on the planet was involved with military operations. So saying that Jim Morrison's father was the admiral, therefore the Doors were some kind of army construct, is laughably idiotic. It's just ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
And I've researched Jim Morrison a great deal. One of the documentaries I'm making with my production company, World Operations Productions, is about the last days of Jim Morrison. So that's a very popularly believed thing that, Jim Morrison was some kind of army created asset to create chaos, because in fact, he was totally estranged from his father, who was an admiral, and even said he was dead in interviews.
Mm-hmm.
These things are easily disproven, but you'd have to give me specific examples of where occultism truly interacted with intelligence agencies. For instance, Aleister Crowley definitely had minor connections, as you say, as an asset, not as an agent, to British intelligence. In World War I, he made outrageous statements supporting Germany to make the German cause look idiotic.
Right.
He did do minor propaganda things like that.
Right.
When Crowley was in Cefalù, Italy, where he had this abbey, this glorified farmhouse he called an abbey, He was thrown out of Italy by Mussolini's secret police because they believed him to be connected to British intelligence. Jack Parsons is subject of all kinds of conspiracy theories. He definitely had high-level security clearance at the Jet Propulsion Agency. Again, Zena and I researched that in great depth. We interviewed people who knew him. We interviewed all the elderly survivors of the Telemic circle he was in Pasadena. We interviewed people who knew, scientists who knew him at Jet Propulsion. I just have to say that all of that is extremely overblown. Do intelligence agencies keep an eye on kooks and eccentric belief systems? Do they try to use them if they can get blackmail or extortion information? Do they look at countercultural or subversive activity in general? Of course they do. But, is there some master plan that this all-powerful, omniscient intelligence agencies utilize occultism, or vice versa? Are there, all-powerful esoteric secret societies that are really steering, I will use the phrase that the stable genius created, the deep state? No, I don't believe that's true. And I understand people think I must be naive, I must not understand, the so-called evidence. But I having seen every kind of occult organization you can imagine, these are mostly inefficient, mediocre people living in a fantasy world. They are about as useful to an intelligence agency as, a homeless person. They have no capacity for power or there's no intelligence there. Secondly, the intelligence agencies are involved with pretty pragmatic aspects of doing research into what the enemies of their particular nation are up to. A lot of it is very pragmatic, boring work. It's not all about mind control and social engineering. I just think that's all wildly exaggerated, and I think it's one of the crises of our time, this gullibility and this willingness to believe that secret powers are controlling everything.
Where do you think some of those ideas, or maybe the popularity of those things, springs from? Is there, for instance, QAnon you brought up? I'm of the persuasion that perhaps QAnon was a method to kind of discredit legitimate things, maybe Jeffrey Epstein, his blackmail circles, by mixing it up and associating it with things like adrenochrome and reptiles and things like this that are obviously outlandish, in an effort to misdirect and kind of delegitimize.
I think there's some truth to what you're saying there. I think the foundational problem why these conspiracy theories and totally fantastic, narratives have become so deeply seeped into our culture everywhere, first of all, is about 40 years of terrible education. I think first of all, that the soil in which these very wrong ideas spread is because people, the school system worldwide, but particularly in the United States, which is one of the fountainheads of this kind of conspiracy paranoia,
right,
is a very poor education system that does not teach people how to research things properly and how to determine how do you use critical thinking to determine what reality is. I think there's very little teaching of history, very little, and very little understanding of logic. So I think when you have a very ill-educated public, and maybe it's longer than 40 years, maybe it's a half a century of bad education, I think people do not know how to understand what is true, what is credible, what's a credible source, and what isn't. Secondly, I think the internet age, I find it very disturbing that people don't seem to understand the difference between propaganda and accurate reporting. And somehow, either on the very extreme woke left or the most extreme MAGA right, and even when I say that, I say these words in quotes, because I don't believe that these modern phenomena are really truly left-wing or right-wing, because they don't even have any connection to what those historical terms actually mean.
But isn't that proof in itself sort of that there is some sort of machination out there that is bastardizing what is true leftism or what is, real conservative, whatever it is, and turning it into this sensationalized thing that's ultimately just used to,
I don't.
divide people.
I think what could look like a malevolent plan is just the momentum of stupidity of and ignorance of the uneducated masses
Mhm.
who just use these terms communism, fascism as buzzwords.
Right.
I mean, for instance, the United States right wing looks at the Democratic Party, which is completely a capitalist enterprise connected to Wall Street and stocks and bonds and the military industrial complex. And
Communists.
yeah, all of the basic foundation of the very establishment. It is in no way Marxist. It is in no way communist. But some elements in the U.S. right wing will throw the smear word communism or cultural Marxism on the most mild social democracy. It's absurd. If but I read things that I don't like. I have read Das Kapital. I have read Marx, and I have rejected him because I've read it. I've been in the DDR. I've seen communism. I've seen how horrible it is. To compare mild social democracy liberalism to state authority of Marxism and communism and Maoism is completely insane, but you see it quite commonly. Secondly, calling Donald Trump a Nazi or a fascist is simply not true. In fact, National Socialists or fascists would condemn Donald Trump as, again, a puppet of Israel, a plutocrat, a servant of the money machine. He is completely the establishment. So I think, fascism is a real phenomenon. National Socialism is an actual body of government and economic policy. And communism is too, and socialism is too. When these words are thrown around willy-nilly as just a smear, like it just means whoever I don't like is this ism or that ism, it loses all meaning. And that's the problem in all the subjects we're talking about, whether it's the Bible, the devil, God, occultism, esotericism, military intelligence, and politics. You have to know what you're talking about. What do these terms mean etymologically? What do they mean historically? And that's the problem. We lack all context, and all there is this emotional diarrhea. I feel this way. And if I feel this way, therefore it must be true, and I'm going to support whatever paranoid idea supports my emotional paranoia and fear.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to point out another
ahead,
thing I want to point out that I noticed, because I haven't been in the United States for a very long time, and now I have returned for several trips to make these documentaries that I'm working on here. I noticed that the kind of paranoid conspiracy thinking that is so prevalent in the political world begins to infect the personal lives of Americans as well. I find in general that citizens of the United States are more paranoid in general, more likely to believe there are sinister plots and forces conspiring against them, even in their own life. So this divisiveness and hatred between the political poles, I see it even manifesting in social relations between people. And I think that's a very disturbing phenomenon, almost like a mass insanity. I don't know if you have noticed that in your dealings with people.
Of course, absolutely. Where I might disagree a little bit on that is everything that you just said is absolutely true, and I've seen that as well. Anecdotally in my own life and just in general. Looking out at kind of the social landscape. But don't you think that there is something to be said for all the paranoia and the people that are so busy, worrying about a Freemason, reptilian Illuminati that's controlling the world, while they've been so distracted worrying about these things? We've had this, technocratic, uber capitalist, monopolistic establishment take over and take hold, and no one's happy. And people are essentially wage slaves and addicted to technology and social, all these horrible things. I mean, that's just barely scratching the surface. But it
Mhm.
reminds me of, this whole conversation actually kind of reminds me of, I'm sure you're familiar with the author Robert Anton Wilson, who wrote a lot of great books, started out as a journalist working at Playboy, and he
Playboy,
said
yeah.
that he was receiving so many letters, in the mail, and this is in like the 70s, of people talking about the Illuminati and, all these different things, that he actually went and wrote a book about it, and combed over all the different conspiracies and all the, occult, everything he could, and wrote a series of books actually about it. And a lot of people nowadays, when they ask where did this idea of, an Illuminati or whatever stem from, even originally, a lot of people trace it back just to that book and say, hey, look, this was a work of fiction, therefore none of it's possible. But it also was seeding kind of these ideas in the general public, and that very idea has been ultimately a misdirection where, like I said a minute ago, this horribly corrupt technocratic government has been able to put itself in power, and everybody's kind of been distracted worrying about the wrong things when they're not just divided down the two-party lines and mad at their
Right.
neighbor. What do you think
Right.
about that?
Yeah, let me try to answer that in two different parts. First of all, Robert Anton Wilson. I read the Illuminatus trilogy in
Mhm.
1975 when it came out,
Mhm.
and it was clear to me that it was a satire of
Absolutely.
conspiracy thinking. It was a satire on, I forget the name of the author, wrote a book about the paranoia in American life.
Mhm.
How that's always been a theme going back to the beginning of the founding of of the United States. Paranoia, persecution, looking for a scapegoat, an idea of secret societies, and all of that. But clearly, Robert Anton Wilson and his co-author Shea were making a parody and a satire of the kind of lunatics who would write letters to Playboy about the Illuminati, about secret societies. The problem is, again, uneducated people read it and think, oh, they're revealing the secrets in the same way that people watch the goddamn Matrix, which is just a Hollywood blockbuster of the most superficial kind, and think that this is a message from the secret societies are telling us through the corrupt adrenochrome drinking reptiles of Hollywood, that this is what's going on with red pills and black pills.
Mhm.
So this is a very sad misunderstanding of assuming that popular culture is somehow controlled by the Illuminati and that it reveals secrets in that way. Um, I generally do not agree with the ideas of Robert Anton Wilson, who was very much an admirer of Aleister Crowley and Timothy Leary, to other people who I consider, not valid sources of anything. And so I don't, personally, I don't really like Robert Anton Wilson's reality tunnel philosophy because it tends to argue that there is no absolute truth and we all create our own world. And that's sort of new age relativism, which I
Right.
don't believe is true. Um, so yeah, the problem is people have no sense of irony or satire. The Illuminatus trilogy by Robert Anton Wilson was kind of a hippie put on. It was the kind of joke. It was kind of like the Paul is dead put on, and
Mhm.
that kind. It was a very typical thing in the '60s and early '70s, but it was a kind of stoned joke that people took seriously,
Mhm.
and that's the problem with it.
Mhm.
Now, the true source of that, I believe, is Nesta Webster, who was an author who wrote a book about secret societies and conspiracy theories in the early 20th century. And a lot of these ideas come from her. If you look, and eventually, a lot of people have asked me to make a film about, because I'm making several documentaries right now. What is the source of these conspiracies and where do they come from and how did they become so prevalent? And I began thinking about that. And I believe if your listeners or watchers look into Nesta Webster, you will see that her book actually had a huge influence.
Mhm.
Also, Madame Blavatsky, a lot of her ideas about root races and lost continents and secret technology has been incorporated into the QAnon
Mhm.
thinking.
Mhm.
So does that answer your question, or was there
Yep.
another aspect to it?
No, absolutely. And I was hoping you could also tell us a little bit more about the documentaries you're working on. I've seen some of your posts recently of you working on that on some of these locations.
Right.
What are those all about?
Well, I'm not going to get into a great detail because with film, pictures speak louder than words, hopefully. And it's kind of like when people ask me to describe my music, you got to listen to it. So you will see them, but generally the subjects are, one is about the last days of Jim Morrison, and more generally a kind of examination of the mystique of his myth, his self-created myth and the folklore and legend that is formed around him and the Doors, and to a certain degree on his death and what his death was really about, what really happened, what the facts of it are. It gets a bit into the 27 Club in general and how false ideas and narratives about the deaths of these figures. So that's one of them. It's about the mystique of the Doors, which I personally, I grew up as a great fan of the Doors, growing up on Venice Beach about 10 years after the Doors were there. I was steeped in that. So it's a subject of personal interest to me as well. The second documentary, which I'm working on primarily in this month, and again, we're recording this interview on August 8th, which was the night that Tex Watson and Linda Kasabian supervised and monitored and instigated the murder of Jay Sebring, Wojtek Krakowski, Abigail Folger, and Sharon Tate and Stephen Parent at Cielo Drive. That happened on this very day that we're speaking. And I'm sure some of your watchers are familiar with my documentary, Charles Manson Superstar. That covered the phenomenon of Manson. This is looking at what these crimes were really about and how, again, this is probably my main subject, that what you think happened is not what happened.
I was going to say that the documentaries and the topic matter of the second one, Tex Watson and the Tate Labianca murders, is a really good segue point kind of for one of the big things I wanted to talk with you tonight about, which is, you're a very outspoken person about the events, and you've written multiple books on the subject and put out documentaries. And some of the more popular narratives surrounding those murders, specifically nowadays, Tom O'Neill's theory about the events that he put quite a few years of research into in his book Chaos. I know that you have your own take on what happened that night and the events surrounding it. So I really wanted to just dig as deep into that as we can. You kind of give us a synopsis of your explanation for why those murders took place, the surrounding circumstances and people involved, and kind of go wherever you want with that.
Right. Well, to sum it up a bit, I mean, again, the Manson File, my book, which actually, the way that synchronicity works with the Manson phenomenon, it has had all kinds of delays and obstacles. And that was true even going back to 1988, when the first Manson File edition was written. It happened in 2011 when the second one came out, and in 2021 after the pandemic and all kinds of issues and obstacles. So the US distribution version of the Manson File, which is printed by a British company called Surrealist Research, is now being distributed by Cargo Records and Torn Light Records in the US. And just by sheer coincidence, the first copies are now hitting US customers today, August 8th, which is the anniversary of the Cielo Drive crime. So in the Manson File, I explain in detail everything, that's possible without writing a 9-volume encyclopedia, which I could, about the subject. So in any event, by strange concordance of synchronicity and coincidence, the copies of the final ultimate revised version of the Manson File are now hitting US customers as we speak, on the anniversary of the Cielo crime. So that book explains what, and now my interest in the phenomenon is not simply what the crimes are about. As I've said many times, in which people think I'm a lunatic for saying, I think Manson had a legitimate philosophy and spiritual teaching that is worth understanding. I believe his music is underappreciated, although it is growing in appreciation and popularity now. And I look at the whole Manson phenomenon, his ecological message, his spiritual message, his music, his politics, and the crimes are only part of the rich tapestry of his existence. But naturally, that's what bleeds leads. And so that's what's going on now, is that when Vincent Bugliosi died in 2015, he started to become discredited. The helter-skelter theory, which I have always been fighting, and from the beginning of my literary career in 1988, and even before that, in television interviews, I have always countered the ridiculous race war, helter-skelter narrative of Vincent Bugliosi. After Bugliosi died, new ideas about what the motives of these murders were have surfaced. And as you said, one of them is Tom O'Neill's book, Chaos, which came out in 2019. And I totally refute that. I think it is as ridiculous as the helter-skelter theory. I think there's absolutely no grounding that Charles Manson was involved with the CIA or MK Ultra whatsoever. I think the evidence in it is based on exaggeration, embellishment, distortion, and frankly, outright lying. I think that Tom O'Neill took advantage of a lot of the people he interviewed and misrepresented what they said and presented a very false idea of what happened. And I think it's extremely irresponsible to the memory of the victims to present it that way. It was not a government orchestrated plot. And I think one really hilarious, ironic thing about it is Tom O'Neill is an arch liberal and Democrat, who despises Trump and MAGA, and the people who have embraced chaos, the people who have embraced his theories about a deep state MK Ultra mind control conspiracy, and basically the rehashing of a Mae Brussell, Dave McGowan idea that the counterculture was a test tube baby created by the CIA as some kind of sinister social engineering plot, and that the murders were somehow a result of MK Ultra mind control experiment gone wrong. I reject it entirely, not even give it the slightest bit of credence. And I explain why in my book, and I will explain why even in more depth, because it's necessary in the documentary I'm making. So I want to make that clear. Mm-hmm. So to answer your question, what after 30 something years of research, and research meaning not, as some people think, looking on the internet at what other people who've had no firsthand experience with these things opine, talking firsthand to the people involved, knowing Manson for decades, talking to people involved with the commune, talking to criminals and underworld figures involved with the narcotics trafficking and porno ring that was going on, talking to people on the Polanski side of things, people who were friends of Sharon Tate, Roman Polanski, Wojtek Frykowski, Jay Sebring, Steve Parent, interviewing people firsthand who really were involved with that phenomenon. People in the Beach Boys entourage, people who knew Terry Melcher. I believe it was an open secret from the beginning in the Hollywood establishment, in the groovy sex, drugs, and rock and roll world of rock musicians and music industry people in Hollywood at that time, who were connected to the Roman Polanski entourage or clique. I have seen it was an open secret that this was a drug deal gone wrong, that Tex Watson and Linda Kasabian were not strangers to the people that they killed, that they were people who knew each other in the narcotics underworld, had a long relationship, and basically the murders opened the curtain a little bit to a seething cesspool of corruption in Hollywood that involved pornography, a private porno ring, international narcotics trafficking on a very high level, money laundering involved with Paramount Studios and the movie industry, and just basically would reveal the level of debauchery of Jeffrey Epstein level going on in the film industry had the truth been known.
Mhm.
And you know, what it comes down to is something very sordid and very banal that happens all the time. It was a disagreement about payment, about a big delivery of drugs, and it was supposed to be a robbery of revenge to get back at Wojtek Frykowski, Roman Polanski's friend, who promised to deliver to Linda Kasabian and Charles Tex Watson a certain amount of the new drug MDA, which
Mhm.
later became ecstasy.
Mhm.
He was trying to corner the market on LA distribution of that new psychedelic. And Tex and Linda wanted to be the street distributors of it. They put in an order for a lot of money to get it, and for some reason, Frykowski didn't deliver. When Susan Atkins had the idea of trying to get money to get a lawyer to protect Bobby Beausoleil, um, who was arrested on August 6th, Linda Kasabian had the idea, I know where there are some rich pigs that ripped us off, let's get money there. So that's basically what happened. That the Labiancas is a much more complicated mystery, which I get into my book and which I will get into in the documentary, that gets into more mafia shenanigans and underworld involvement with all kinds of you know, just ordinary sordid crime. Nothing to do with occultism, nothing to do with the CIA, but high level criminal activity. And as Charlie made two statements about the crimes that I think are germane. He said, you know, gangsters are always killing other gangsters. And that's basically what happened. That is criminal rivalry among drug dealers, which is, you know, a very common thing in the underworld. That was the basis of what happened at Cielo Drive. Though there were other personal hostilities between these people and other connections, but the main thing that motivated the killing was Tex Watson was on speed that night. Linda Kasabian was, Susan Atkins. And when you're on speed, you overreact, and the kind of overkill that they did is very typical of meth murders. So, you know, it basically has to do with a sordid business of drug deal gone wrong. And that is true with the Gary Hinman murder, true with Cielo Drive, true with the shooting of Bernard Crowe, which, you know, most people who are not connoisseurs of the case don't even know about. There were other crimes
Right.
that led up to Cielo Drive and afterwards the Labianca.
So there's not any credence to the copycat theory saying that, you know, they were doing that Gary Hinman had been murdered and they were trying to essentially make it look like the killer would still be on the loose by committing murders kind of in the
Right.
same
There
pedigree.
are some people who give credence to that. The way that I would put that is okay, at Cielo Drive, the only thing that in any way copied the Hinman killing, and I'm assuming that people who are listening to me have some grasp of what these crimes are about without having to go through the whole chronology. Bobby Beausoleil killed Gary Hinman, and he, on his own, made the decision to try to distract the police from who really did it. He put up the words political piggy in Gary Hinman's blood, and he made a paw print that indicated the signature of the Black Panthers, because the paw print was the symbol of the Black Panther Party. So he was trying to blame blacks for the murder of his friend Gary Hinman in a you know, a routine misunderstanding about a drug payment.
Since it's pretty commonly agreed upon now that the Bugliosi narrative of the race war, you know, is not true, why would Beausoleil have had a motivation to pin the murder on the Black Panthers?
Well, the answer is in your question. Basically, Bugliosi took the fact that Beausoleil, and not Manson, but Beausoleil used this racist thing to do, because Gary Hinman was a leftist. He supported radical causes like the Black Panthers and that sort of thing. And Bobby Beausoleil at the time, though he won't admit it now, was rather right-wing. He was reading things like Yaki's Imperium. He definitely had racist and right-wing sympathies, and he didn't like or approve of Gary Hinman's leftist support of Black power and that kind of thing. So, you know, he basically, in a moment of desperation, tried to pin this on blacks, but it wasn't part of some master plan to create a race war.
Okay.
Bugliosi took that and ran with it. Now, I have some people who characterize me as a Manson apologist and have said that I'm claiming that Helter Skelter was invented by Bugliosi. I want to correct that. Helter Skelter was something that the communes spoke about. In general, when Manson was in prison in Terminal Island in the 60s, he met not Black Panthers, but Nation of Islam members, followers of Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X, who were talking about, when we get out of prison, there's going to be a revolution. We're going to kill Whitey. There's going to be a race war. Mm-hmm. He came out of prison believing, and if you look at the events of 1968, when Martin Luther King was shot and there was, racial strife and riots all over America, this was a very common idea that there is going to be a race war. It isn't that Manson wanted to start one, it's that he believed there was going to be one, and that he should take his loose-linked group, this commune that was never called the Family, by the way, didn't even have a name. That's something the media glommed onto it.
Ed Sanders?
Partially Ed Sanders because of the name of the book, The Family. Also, Greg Jacobson had the idea to call the group, the band, the musical group that Charlie had, Family Jams. And so, there's a vague connection there, but there were all kinds of families. There was the family dog in San Francisco. This family idea was a very typical counterculture buzzword. Mm-hmm. So, but to get to the main point, Charlie believed, and there was every ample reason to believe it were true in 1968 and 69, there's going to be a race war, and we should get out of this sick city that's going to fall apart and crumble when there is a race war, get out to the desert and become survivalists, basically, though that word didn't exist yet, to get away from it. He didn't want to cause it. Bugliosi's perverse genius was to take this loose stone talk about a coming race war and the fact that Bobby Beausoleil did try to pin his murder on non-existent Black murderers into his helter-skelter theory. But
is it true that Steve McQueen and Peter Sellers and a group of some other famous actors at the time put together some rewards for bringing forward information? And also, I've heard that Steve McQueen, on the day of the murders, I believe, was maybe at the house trying to clean up some drug evidence, something that he was involved with.
I get into all that in my book and in my film. Actually, my associate Derek Hayes and I, in 2018, we took the route from Cielo Drive to Jay Sebring's house on Eastern Drive, and we stopped at Portola, which is where the killers washed their hands of the blood. Because, and this is complicated, but this is the real story of what they were doing. They wanted to hold Jay Sebring and Sharon Tate hostage because there were not enough drugs at Cielo Drive for some reason, not as much as they wanted. And they knew that Jay Sebring, who was a major drug dealer to the stars, had a secret stash in his mansion on Easton, which is not very far at all. And they wanted to take Tate and Sebring there. After this whole thing turned into a panicky catastrophe and they killed them, they decided they would try to get to Eastern Drive anyway. Now, Steve McQueen really was supposed, you hear rumors of celebrities that were supposed to be there that night. I know that Steve McQueen really was the owner of the Whiskey A Go-Go. Elmer Valentine was with him that night and told me that was the case, that they were headed there, but they got distracted, in his words, by some chicks that night.
What about Mama Cass Elliot?
Mama Cass Elliot, a whole other story. She was a very good friend of Charles Manson and Jay Sebring and Abigail Folger, and they mingled together at her party pad, which I just photographed the other day and put in my documentary, that was on Woodrow Wilson Drive in the Hollywood Hills. The Mamas and the Papas were very deeply involved, as were the Beach Boys. John Phillips, the founder of the mamas and the papas, was actually at the crime scene later that night. He went there looking for drugs because he had an involvement with Wojtek Frykowski, and he actually entered the crime scene, saw the dead bodies, in a panic, ran to the house of Michael Butler, who was the producer of the hippie musical Hair, and told him in the middle of the night what happened. And that led to a massive cover-up that involved people like Dennis Hopper. Steve McQueen, being a very good friend of Jay Sebring, enlisted the aid of two women, one of them the receptionist at Jay Sebring's hair salon, the other a friend of Roman Polanski's, a lover of his, to go. He didn't go into Jay Sebring's house, but he supervised their removal and getting rid of and even flushing the drugs down the toilet before the cops got there.
Was
But
this
what I
primarily
show in my
MDA?
document- Excuse me?
Was this primarily MDA that was being trafficked in the circle?
No, what MDA was what Wojtek Frykowski had promised to sell Linda Kasabian and Tex Watson.
Mm-hmm.
The drugs that were at Sebring's were cocaine, LSD, and other drugs. But cocaine was the main thing Sebring dealt in. And that, by the way, I have confirmed from a employee of Sebring International. When you see my documentary, there is absolutely no doubt anymore. People who worked with Sebring and knew about what he was up to have confirmed that Sebring International was partially a front for a narcotics trafficking organization, that he was called the Candy Man in his auspices as one of the drug dealers to the stars. So there's not even any doubt about that. I've gotten a confession from somebody involved with Sebring International that was the case. So yeah, Steve McQueen and many other people were involved with covering up what would have made them clearly complicit in a major drug dealing circle.
Okay. I'll be totally transparent with you. And I find Tom O'Neill's theories about, the murders to be very compelling. And I also don't doubt for a minute the angle, that you're explaining as well of this drug trafficking and stuff. And I see that there aren't too many conflicting things where parts of both could be true. And I want you to hear me out on kind of some of these ideas. And also just, if, I want to hear how you would dismantle or discredit these various components of it. And I look at it as two big components. During this time, it's a proven fact that the CIA and that Project MKUltra and through these things, that there were hundreds of institutions across America, that they were encouraging scientists, researchers, professors to be using LSD and researching it and helping with the proliferation of LSD and various other psychedelics. We also know that some of these other drugs, like MDMA, some of them do have their roots in, sometimes tenuously, but connected nonetheless, agencies, whether it's Sandoz Laboratories or whatever, to intelligence agencies. So for instance, Charles Taco and I think Billy Doyle, some of these other guys, Hank Fine, a lot of these guys are known families with intelligence, military or naval intelligence connections. I think Charles Taco was one of the ones that was bringing MDMA directly from Canada or somewhere like that. And you also have things like the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic, where Dave Smith
Let me stop you right there.
Go ahead.
David Smith.
That's one point in itself. So
yeah, David Smith, who Tom O'Neill smears and lies about and made up absolute nonsense about, has absolutely denied completely in a documentary that will be coming out. He said it's complete nonsense. The CIA did not fund the Haight-Ashbury. He had no connection to it. O'Neill also smeared the memory of Roger Smith, who was one of Charlie's probation officers. I want to make it clear, there's not the least proof of that to be true. And O'Neill has kept pushing that and pushing it and pushing it. It's not true. And I will demolish and debunk the idea that the Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic was some kind of MK Ultra center.
I'm interested to hear that.
Nor is there any proof whatsoever that Jolyon West ever encountered Charles Manson. And I want to say that Tom O'Neill doesn't have the courage or the guts to talk to anyone on any of these podcasts he's done with anyone who knows anything about the actual case. He talks to gullible people who believe in these conspiracy theories and will not question what he's putting across. So I want to make it clear, Tom O'Neill is no more closer to the truth than Vincent Bugliosi was, and in many ways he has done more damage to the cause of truth. Vincent Bugliosi's ideas were closer to at least something that was going on. Tom O'Neill is spreading fiction. It is a lie. There is no connection whatsoever. Charles Manson was not a guinea pig that was trained at the Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic or anywhere. It is a completely illogical theory that doesn't hold up. What even is the theory? Did Charlie Manson learn how to control people's minds, and then 2 years later he forced Tex Watson and Linda Kasabian to do these crimes? If you really look at what he's arguing, he never comes out and tells you. He insinuates, he implies, he hints, but he provides absolutely no proof. And in the interviews he's done, he lets gullible people fall for this insinuation, and he doesn't have the guts to say he doesn't know, that he doesn't have proof. And I think it's an outrageous lie, and it excuses Tex Watson, it excuses Linda Kasabian, and it removes the sovereignty of their will. They murdered these people based on their own criminal convictions.
Mm-hmm.
CIA had nothing to do with it. MK Ultra had nothing to do with it. It makes about as much sense as Trump's nonsense about the deep state. And I know there are people that believe that. And Candace Owens, another moron, and Tucker Carlson, who I have absolutely no respect for. This is the ilk of people who are supporting Tom O'Neill's nonsense, which is essentially supporting the QAnon propaganda. So, I will prove to you that Roger Smith, everything that Tom O'Neill wrote about him pretty much is not true. Charlie's parole officer. And there is an interview that exists in which Roger Smith, before he died, refutes O'Neill's claims. David Smith, who worked at the Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic, totally refutes these things. So it's to read Chaos and say that that's true is no more than reading Robert Anton Wilson's Illuminatus. Are there good things in Chaos? Yes. In the beginning of the book, the stuff that Tom learned about Terry Melcher and Bugliosi and Rudy Altobelli lying. But what were they lying about? They were covering up an international narcotics trafficking ring connected to the mafia and the entertainment world. They were not covering up any kind of CIA activity, in my opinion, after 30 years of researching this thing. And I want to point out, as far as knowing Charles Manson, and I've said this before, but I think it pithily sums up the issue. Tom O'Neill talked to Charlie for about 30 minutes. I talked to him for about 30 years. I think I know what Charles Manson was and wasn't. He was not a stooge. He was not cooperating with the government. And this ties in to right-wing propaganda that the hippie movement was inauthentic, that it was invented by the CIA as some kind of social engineering project. And I don't buy it for 1 second. So I want to make it clear. I don't find this evidence compelling. And I can prove, as other people, for instance, Paul Jacobs, who hosts the Paulcast, which is a very good podcast about the Manson phenomenon. He has disproven many of the lies that Tom O'Neill has spread very aggressively and very forcefully, and shown that he presents information in a false way to lead people to believe in this MK Ultra conspiracy. So I will have to be forceful in refuting it. I think it's a dead end, and it is no more worth looking at than Bugliosi idea of helter skelter.
That's why I wanted you to get you on here, was to discuss this and understand what you don't believe about it, and to kind of hear your discrediting of it.
I want to say, and I want to make it clear, I knew Tom O'Neill very well. He came to me and my ex-wife Zena in 1999 when he knew nothing about the case. We gave him all kinds of information that he followed up on, and I don't know why he dropped what I believe to be the truth, which is what I have told is the truth from people who knew the victims. to go into this fantasy world. I don't know if the publisher thought that would sell better. I don't know if his ghostwriter decided that that would be the better angle to go with for commercial purposes. But I will, you know, I absolutely refute it, and I believe it is irresponsible. And it isn't just wrong, it is a deliberate lie based on presenting information incorrectly and deliberately fudging things to present a false narrative, as Bugliosi did. So if Tom O'Neill wants to attack Bugliosi, I'm saying he's the new Bugliosi, creating more bullshit, more clouds of obscuration, not leading us to the truth, but leading us away from it.
Mm-hmm. We don't have to get too much into the reason I brought up Dave Smith was basically, not any sort of proof, as Tom himself would say. I know that he doesn't like to draw any conclusions without evidence. That's his explanation kind of for that. But just the parallel between the research that Dave Smith was doing on rodents and amphetamines, and that they would turn violent on each other in these small, settings when they were being experimented with, and the parallel between that and Charlie Manson's family and the murders that were done that night that were on speed.
One person, Charles Tex Watson, already a drug dealer going back to 1967, before he ever met Charles Manson, already robbing other drug dealers as his MO. Linda Kasabian, a drug dealer even when she was a teenager, arrested in a major acid operation in Boston in 1967. These two drug dealers got involved with each other romantically and sexually, and they formed the plot to go get revenge. Totally sordid, normal criminal activity. Are you telling me that Tex Watson and Linda Kasabian needed to be brainwashed to... You take some scummy drug dealers and give them meth and send them after their enemies, and you will get the results. You don't need MK Ultra. You don't need Jolly and West. You don't need the Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic. You need to take two sociopaths who are angry and in a very hot night did something horrible because they were on meth and because this robbery turned out the wrong way. I'm telling you, this is a sordid criminal operation that could happen on any street corner in Los Angeles tonight, and you don't need the CIA to make it happen.
And while that is true, these things you do have to admit were happening concurrently. MK Ultra.
What does that mean? So what?
Well, for instance, the most compelling piece of O'Neill's research that, in my opinion, is the correspondence that he discovered between Jolly West and Sidney Gottlieb. That's a direct connection, and I think it is a little...
It's not a direct connection.
Well, let me finish my point with it. My point is that Jolly West was working at the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic at this time. O'Neill will admit that he couldn't find a direct connection between him and Manson, but to say that he was working there at the same exact time that Manson was frequenting this place on almost a daily or at least weekly basis, and that he had no idea who he was or no type of interaction with him, I find that to be far-fetched.
And do you believe Charles Manson was a willing subject of Jolly and West, that he was some kind of gullible fool who would say, oh yeah, what do you think? What do you think happened?
I don't think so. I wouldn't say gullible, but I know that humans are humans, and some people can be taken advantage of. You yourself have admitted that, there's such thing as an asset, a person who is, working unbeknownst to themselves for an agency or institution. To
what purpose would these murders serve the CIA? That's what I would like to ask Tom O'Neill. What does he fucking think is the purpose of killing a movie star, a hairdresser, a coffee heiress, and an out-of-work friend of Roman Polanski? Why would that lead to anything?
He doesn't put an answer for that. He doesn't
because he's a liar. He's a liar who is spreading nonsense and lies that is reaching unbelievable proportions of more deception. And it is misleading people away from the legal and criminal responsibility of Charles Watson and Linda Kasabian.
And I agree with you that they are responsible, for their own actions. I agree with that.
Let's go through this. Let's say Charlie Manson was some gullible fool who immediately fell into a plot of being taught brainwashing by Jolly and West, which is laughably ridiculous. It didn't happen. There's no proof that it happened, that David Smith and Roger Smith were involved in this plot to control Charlie Manson and make him into a MK Ultra, I don't know what, assassin for some mysterious reason. How come it took 2 years for Linda Kasabian, who just joined the group July 4th, 69, and Tex Watson, who kept leaving the group and leading his own independent drug dealing operation that had nothing to do with intelligence? How did that happen? Do you think Linda Kasabian and Tex Watson would not go that night to kill these people without the evil influence of the CIA? Or do you believe that criminals can go kill rival drug dealers on their own volition? That is the question that needs to be answered. How does it go from Jolyon West to Tex Watson, who never met him?
So I do have a theory that actually doesn't need either the MK Ultra angle or the drug angle necessarily, and I think it's one that you might have some agreement with. And I've talked to Tom about this in the past, this theory, but it kind of involves something that a theme that comes up a lot in the Manson story, which is that of videotaped sexual activities and blackmail.
Yes, I get into that in great detail. Yes,
that's what I find to be the most realistic or likely cause of the murders. Is it's true that Bugliosi hid tapes of Sharon Tate that Roman Polanski had filmed of her being with unwilling participants. You have Dennis Hopper on record talking about.
I get into this in the Manson File and in my documentary far more than anybody has ever revealed. There was a porno ring, absolutely.
I want to know more about that. I'm very interested in that angle
of the murders. That was not the reason for the murders either.
What about
this was going on? Huh?
I'm sorry. I was going to ask about an interview with Manson from, I believe, the mid 80s, where he says Sharon was killed over a little black book, and he brings up Peter Sellers in the closet with poor little Sharon and a dog.
Right.
That sounds like exactly what you're talking about, a porno ring or blackmail.
He said Lino LaBianca was killed over a little black book, not Sharon Tate.
Okay.
And I have a long interview, which I did with Charlie, which I have made public, in which he explains what the black book was. And that was connected to Lino LaBianca and the Beach Boys, not to Sharon Tate.
Okay.
The interview you're referring to is Bill Murphy, a former associate of mine, in 1993 interviewed Charlie. And Charlie talked about poor Sharon. And yes, Charlie knew all about the personal sexual life of Roman Polanski and Sharon Tate. I believe he knew all about the pornography that was going on. He himself had been a pornographer since the 1950s. And he himself had the same kind of video equipment that Roman Polanski had. Dennis Wilson gave him a state-of-the-art video machine from Sony, the same one that Robert Evans gave to Polanski. Okay. So the porno ring and blackmail and extortion, it even gets into Hugh Hefner and Victor Lowndes, who is...
What about Roy Radin and those murders?
Roy
Radin
was many years later. The Cotton Club was connected to Robert Evans, who was Roman Polanski's friend.
Right.
And Robert Evans was the protege of Sidney Korshak, the major Chicago mob figure who was a fixer in Hollywood, who is responsible for covering up the drug dealing, the pornography. So yes, the police found there was much more than one tape. The police found all kinds of pornography at Cielo Drive. Sharon Tate willingly and unwillingly participated, as did many other music and movie personalities, in this private porno ring.
Was this just for personal pleasure?
Yeah, for personal pleasure, just like people film themselves now on their smartphones fucking. It was just on a state-of-the-art video equipment, and it was with famous people, so it was much more sensitive.
Yeah.
Hugh Hefner collected what he called fame porn. Like he went back and found footage of Joan Crawford in pornographic films, or Marilyn Monroe, or he spent a huge amount of money, and his right-hand man, Victor Lowndes, they both collected pornography.
I've read that Bugliosi was also close friends with Hugh Hefner. Is that true?
Yes.
Could that also be another motive for Bugliosi wanting to establish a false narrative around the murders?
Absolutely, another reason. Hugh Hefner is deeply involved in this.
If these were
Bugliosi
all just
wanted
consensual if these were all just adult consensual acts, what would Bugliosi have to be so ashamed or hide with all
in,
these people, you know?
in 1969, Steve McQueen and Peter Sellers and Warren Beatty and Jane Fonda and
Mhm.
people of this ilk
Mhm.
having pornographic tapes of them
Mhm.
indulging in acts that were at that time considered taboo would have destroyed their careers. It would have destroyed Hollywood. I mean, the number of celebrities involved with these pornographic films. Also, Rudy Altobelli, the owner of Cielo Drive,
Mhm.
in his he had a separate gay pornography operation going on, and all kinds of closeted gay celebrities were involved in those porno operations. And
Mhm.
he had his own film company called Cottage Films, which is a pun on in Britain when homosexual men would meet in a bathroom. It was called cottaging. And Rudy Altobelli was an open, flamboyant homosexual at the
Right.
time who basically ran what was called the Velvet Mafia, which
Mhm.
was a secret circle of closeted gay men, including Cary Grant, which I get into Cary Grant's deep involvement in the Cielo Drive affair. Um, the police found tons of gay pornography, which was illegal at that time, in Rudy Altobelli's guest house. So pornography played a huge part in what was covered up, but it was not the cause of the murders. Jay Sebring was a sadomasochist. Sharon Tate was a willing masochist, and when she was involved with Sebring, they had a sadomasochistic BDSM relationship, which is part of the reason why when Manson went back to the house, Tate and Sebring were tied together with this rope. It was a way of saying to Hollywood, you know, making it look like an inside job, but also revealing their secrets.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, so, you know, at that time in 1969, this kind of things would have been considered career destroying, you know, absolutely unheard of. These days,
Okay.
Kim Kardashian releases her own pornographic tape to become famous. In 1969, seeing, you know, famous people having sex would have destroyed their career.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
complicity in a drug dealing network, which is going on as well.
Yeah.
But
That's
it
important
wasn't the
context.
motivation for the murders, it was the motivation for the cover up of the murders.
Okay. Okay. Along with the drugs too, you're
Yeah,
saying.
not only drugs, but even more boring crimes like money laundering, uh, stealing from JFK Airport by the mafia. All a huge amount of underworld activity was connected or peripherally connected to Cielo Drive
I've got a
and the
couple more
Labiancas.
I've got a couple more questions I want to ask you that go along this kind of blackmail or sexual, however you want to refer to it as.
Right.
But Kenneth Anger is a character that pops up quite a bit in these circles too, and you know, even specifically with Manson, Bobby Beausoleil was supposed to play a specific character in one of his films that I think originally was supposed to be played by Vito Politicus's son, who was kind of this
Mhm.
proto Manson figure. Both
Right.
that figure, Vito Politicus and Charles Manson, were known to have these, you know, gaggles of very
I can
willing
explain the
underage
connection.
participants.
There is a direct connection. Yeah.
There's one more aspect just to my question, is that tying into kind of the fame porn and the porno ring that you've talked about at the Tate house. Also, there's been rumors for many years. I've never seen really much substantiation of them, but kind of checks out, at least in my opinion, that Kenneth Anger would basically make some of his films that were kind of off the market and made for very specific clientele, and it's always hinted at that they were of a sexual nature, maybe
Yes, that's
illegal or
true.
borderline illegal. What do you know
That,
about that?
that is true. Yes. Uh, Kenneth Anger knew, for instance, King Faisal of Saudi Arabia, who had a huge pornography collection and was an infamous womanizer
Hmm.
who collected beautiful women from around the world with his wealth. And he commissioned, according to Kenneth Anger
Hmm.
himself, told me this, that King Faisal commissioned him to make private pornography for him. So that's true.
Hmm. Wasn't Faisal somehow related to the Khashoggi or Adnan
Yes,
Khashoggi, who
yes.
also
And
popped up in the Roy Radin,
yes,
even the Epstein case,
not
the
only that,
Khashoggis
not
were
only
related.
that, when there is a direct connection Gene Gutowski, who is the person who revealed to me what the crimes were really about, was Adnan Khashoggi's right-hand man. After he fell out with Polanski, he was deeply and intimately involved with Adnan Khashoggi, who was running an international prostitution ring of a massive level, which did involve extortion, blackmail of politicians.
He was involved with Roy Cohen, who was a New York prosecutor or something, who was one of Donald Trump's mentors.
Great moral guardian and mentor.
Yeah. I mean, this all, to me, the blackmail angle is extremely under-investigated with this whole case. I mean, you have Adnan Khashoggi, Roy Cohen. That's related to Jeffrey Epstein. I mean, that's only one degree of separation from Jeffrey Epstein.
I want to accentuate, it's not even 1 degree. Roman Polanski and Gene Gutowski, who was Polanski's best friend and the person who brought him from Poland to England and helped create his career as a director, was directly involved with Adnan Khashoggi as his right-hand man for years. And he bragged about it to us. He was proud of it. He loved it. He talked about the debauchery of the Cielo Drive years and of the Adnan Khashoggi years. He was a total hedonist, who an admitted, hedonist who loved all that. So there's a direct connection. Furthermore, what you're talking about, blackmail, if you look at the Lana Turner case of Johnny Stompanato, where Johnny Stompanato was the lover of the movie star Lana Turner, and he was murdered at her Beverly Hills home, supposedly by Lana Turner's daughter. In fact, Lana Turner murdered him herself, but it was covered up and they blamed it on the daughter so she would do less time and to avoid her mother's imprisonment as a murderess. Johnny Stompanato, I believe, was involved with a porno ring that the mafia ran of filming men and women, famous celebrities and movie stars, luring them into sexual activity, filming them, and then presenting them with the film, like, pay us this much or we will release this.
Pay us or, do our political bidding or something like that as well.
They really more about money, like pay us. Again, that's implying that there's some sinister purpose other than criminal activity, which I don't believe. It is pay us or we will destroy your career. And I believe that Charlie Manson, who had direct links to the syndicate of Mickey Cohen and the LA underworld, Charlie was already doing pornography with his 3-star productions in 1959, which was a Hollywood prostitution ring. And he admitted this to me. He would go to the Greyhound bus station in Hollywood, pick up young hopefuls who wanted to be movie stars and tell them he was a movie producer and involve them in pornography. So I think there's a direct link between the Johnny Stompanato, Mickey Cohen extortion of celebrities through pornography and what was going on at Cielo Drive. Absolutely.
At a certain level of these people, I feel like power is a much more valuable currency than money itself. And I just feel like the parallels are too strong to kind of be dismissed as just that. We know that Epstein, that was much more than money. We know that it was primarily political. Ghislaine Maxwell's family and Robert Maxwell and Mossad, all these things,
connected to Mossad, absolutely. It is an interesting synchronicity because I think these things reveal things about the truth, even if the world doesn't want to know it. In 2019, on August 10th, almost 5 years ago, in 2019, I gave a lecture on the night of the Labianca murder anniversary at Zebulon, and I showed my film, Charles Manson Superstar, and I gave a speech called Once Upon a Lie in Hollywood, because Tarantino's ridiculous film had just come out. And on that night was the night that Jeffrey Epstein died, however he died. And I saw a direct connection. And now I agree with you completely. The kind of thing Epstein was doing is what was going on at Cielo Drive and in this whole commercial mafia-owned pornography racket and ring.
So it had to be a little more than monetary motivations.
Well, you're saying that with Jeffrey Epstein, I have no doubt there's the Mossad connection with Ghislaine Maxwell's father being Robert Maxwell. I do not believe there's any intelligence connection to it with the Bob Crane case. Are you aware of that?
Yeah, vaguely, yeah.
Bob Crane was a private maker of pornography, of him with all kinds of women. And he did it on video too. And there's a direct connection to the Cielo Drive porno ring there. I think people exaggerate that there's some kind of sinister conspiracy machination behind it. These were people with power who were making pornography because they could. They were even making professionally lit films at Paramount Studios, like well-made pornographic films that have never been seen by the general public. But this was for private entertainment, and of course, it's the mafia that was involved with it, not the CIA. They were exploiting this to control the careers and, monetary rewards that they could gain by blackmailing and extorting people. Epstein is similar, but obviously he is an intelligence agent of some kind,
Right.
And the involvement of Mossad. Interestingly, Lawrence Merrick, who made the well-known Manson documentary, which people have probably the best known documentary about Manson from 1973, he was a Mossad agent. He was an Israeli involved with Mossad. So there's something very suspicious about his involvement in it. But I don't believe the pornography ring that was going on in 1969 that was connected to Hugh Hefner and the Playboy empire largely. I don't think it had a specific motivation to, what did they make Mama Cass or Steve McQueen do politically? It would have just embarrassed them if these pornography tapes had been released. That's, to my mind, all there is to it. And that's enough. And a lot of closeted gay men like Liberace and other people were blackmailed and extorted in this time. This is Hollywood going back to the 1920s. It's a very Hollywood story.
Of course. No, that is important context. I agree. There's two other points about just the connections that I see there that I don't see really discussed anywhere else. And you may dispute a couple of these, but I just want to hear me out again.
Sure.
Manson was at a time, he was at the Boys Town in Nebraska,
Right.
correct? This is also, infamously a big part of the Franklin scandal story. I don't know how much.
I don't know anything about the Franklin scandal, but I do know Boys Town was, of course, the boys were molested. All kinds of sexual harassment was going.
More than that, even, used in the procurement of blackmail by, U.S. senators and the Larry King guy.
Right.
So there's not really anything more to that other than just it's a crazy coincidence to me that he was at Boys Town and you have the blackmail aspects of the Manson story and the Franklin scandal itself. So I don't know anything else about that. I have nothing else to say about it.
I believe it is very possible that Charles used his knowledge of the sexual proclivities of celebrities that he slept with. He knew that Dennis Wilson was secretly bisexual. He slept with him. Dennis Wilson was having sex with Rudy Altobelli, the owner of Cielo Drive. Charlie knew the secrets of a lot of celebrities. And I have no doubt, because of his criminal proclivities, he would certainly threaten to extort and blackmail. I'm sure that that's true. I don't have specific proof of it, but that's what was going on in Hollywood. And I know Charlie's malicious thinking. And that's why I believe if he had anything to do with the CIA, he would have proudly revealed it, because Tom O'Neill does not understand Charlie's absolute hatred of authority, hatred of the government.
But wasn't he also loyal to this kind of the street ethics of not ever snitching and not giving people up?
To the criminal underworld?
Absolutely. I see.
And part of it is the criminal underworld never cooperates with the federal government or the police or the CIA.
Well, that's not true, though. I mean, there's plenty
Charlie maintained that he would never do that.
And I thought you were saying in general that they don't. There's no overlap.
Snitches and informants. Of course, that's the life's-blood of intelligence agencies and law enforcement. No,
totally misheard you there.
Yeah, Charlie's criminal code was you don't snitch on other criminals. You don't, you never. He allowed himself to be made the mastermind of a crime that he knew Ted Watson and Linda Kasabian
Mhm.
were responsible for,
Mhm.
because he didn't want to break the criminal code. And as he got older, he sort of did, but it took a long time before he would get into the truth about it. But Charlie would never cooperate with the police. He would never cooperate with the CIA, the FBI, or any authority. And anyone who thinks he would just does not understand his outlaw nature. And it's also an insult. It's not only an insult to the victims, the CIA bullshit, it is an insult to Charles, who was my friend and who I know he was a criminal. But an outlaw, saying that an outlaw worked with the federal government is the worst thing you can say. And in fact, it is O'Neill and the right-wing Republican MAGA idiots that support O'Neill largely. It's a way of discrediting Manson's integrity. And I dispute that entirely. It's saying that Manson was willing to cooperate with the CIA and to protect their secrets. He would not have.
Last connection with the whole blackmail thing, and this one is
Uh-huh.
kind of out, admittedly it's kind of out there, taking it all the way back to Jack Parsons, who obviously, you know, worked on the early jet propulsion technology, and we can't get into his whole backstory out there, but if people want to get into it, there's plenty to read. One of the more famous books that's been written about him, Sex and Rockets, at the very end, it's talking about after he died, you know, the mishap or whatever it was that happened that took Jack Parsons' life. The police or the FBI or some agency took from the crime scene this black box that you know, he
I'm
was
very
some part
aware.
of his magical workings. And this book claims that some of the Los Angeles Police Department have testified or said that there were videotapes in it of him having sexual relations with his mother and their family dog. So,
Okay, let me explain that to you.
mhm,
Who was the publisher of that book?
I'm not sure.
Feral
Not sure.
House.
Okay, I
Feral
see where
House.
you're going. I see where you're going with this.
Adam Parfrey was a liar who would put in any bullshit to sell his books.
Mm-hmm,
I
mm-hmm,
unfortunately had dealings with him.
mm-hmm.
He was a sociopathic liar, and the author of that book complained bitterly about this incest thing that Parfrey created whole cloth.
So
He's
no,
not,
no LAPD people ever said that. That's not true.
not
Did
that I
those?
know. And let me point out that Zena and I researched the Parsons thing in depth. Zena interviewed Cameron. Almost nobody did that. We interviewed Jean Foreman, who was the widow of Ed Foreman, who was Jack Parsons' best friend.
Mm-hmm,
We interviewed all kinds of people that knew Parsons, Forey J. Ackerman, people in the science fiction world, people who were involved in the Telemic community that Parsons was involved with. It's an absolute lie, and it is a lie. Adam Parfrey, who I worked with and who I broke with very forcefully in 1989, continually put bullshit in his books to try to sell them. And I'm very aware of the black box and all that.
mm-hmm.
This claim of incest is nonsense that he created, and the author of that book complained bitterly about it. And
I wasn't aware of that. Interesting.
I can tell you that almost every author, not all of them, some of them kissed his ass to get money, but honest people who worked with this person have all, he tried to stick in something sensational and ridiculous to sell his books. And that is a slur against Parsons, and like O'Neill's nonsense, it's not true.
I've always taken that part of it with a grain of salt.
Right.
And it's
I mean, I
obviously
wish I could, I
sensational.
know that the author who wishes to remain anonymous bitterly complained about Parfrey including that in there.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That aside, the connection or whatever you want to call it there with the whole blackmail thing is that Frank Molina, who was Jack Parsons' kind of right-hand man at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory,
Right.
Frank Molina's son, Roger, is married to Ghislaine Maxwell's sister, Christine Maxwell, which
Right.
just seems way too coincidental, you know, to be nothing. And I can offer no more insight into that other than that's a strange coincidence.
Well, let me point this out. For instance, Charlene, um, there was a woman that Charlie Manson was sleeping with who was connected to someone who was involved with the Nexium cult.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Later, actually, a relative of hers ended up in the Nexium cult. Now, that seems like, okay, conspiracy theorists will say, well, there must be a connection there, but there isn't. Sometimes rich, powerful people run in the same circles. That's what I believe. So my opinion of Jack Parsons is not that he was some powerful magician connected to secret intelligence things at all. And I, obviously, I think people are overestimating the competence of these intelligence agencies and making too much of coincidences, for sure.
Yeah, that one just, I understand it. It very well may be a coincidence, but to me, it's just such a strange and bizarre one,
Now, I want to point out, Parsons, the FBI did look into the possibility that the reason he was trying to leave his laboratory that day when he had the accident was because he was trying to sell some secrets about rocketry or weaponry to Israel or China.
I've heard that too.
And it's true. Other people around him did say that he, because of his belief in the Book of the Law and the prophecies of Aleister Crowley, he believed Israel could be the Ptolemaic nation that he believed Crowley prophesied. So it is true. The FBI looked into the possibility that Parsons was rushing to leave California and go to Mexico, where he was seeking sanctuary, because he may well have been dealing on an espionage level with China or Israel. So that's a fact.
Do you have a personal theory as to what was in the black box?
I don't know. I've heard all kinds of rumors, and I don't know. But definitely not. Unfortunately, the more sensational nonsense is what sticks with people.
Yeah.
And I also think the whole L. Ron Hubbard, Parsons, Cameron thing has been way overblown into this romanticized folklore and legend and myth.
Didn't Hubbard claim that the FBI sent him to kind of investigate the OTO and kind of infiltrate it from the inside?
Let me explain that. L. Ron Hubbard tried to hide the fact that he stole a great deal of Scientology's half-baked science fiction
from
cosmology from Crowley, from Buddhism, from general semantics, from many, many sources, and when it was discovered by a journalist that Hubbard had been involved with what they call the black magic cult, with the OTO, with Jack Parsons' Pasadena branch of the Ordo Templi Orientis, that was Hubbard's cover-up. He said, "Oh, no, I wasn't interested in that kind of thing. The FBI sent me there." Absolutely no proof of that happening. The government dismissed L. Ron Hubbard as a mentally ill malingerer and pathological liar. He was not working for the FBI. I mean, that was his cover-up of another thing L. Ron Hubbard did. The reason people believe that the Process Church of the Final Judgment was involved in the Tate Labianca crimes or Manson is because Hubbard, who hated the Process Church because they were a splinter group who left Scientology and Dianetics, formed their own group. When the Manson crimes happened, he smeared their reputation by having his ethics committee contact the media and say the Process is behind this. The Process were connected. So, to trust L. Ron Hubbard about anything is a very slippery slope. And he was never employed by the FBI or any federal authority.
Is there any truth to the rumors that Charles Manson was a member of the Solar Lodge of OTO, Gene Brayton's lodge in Los Angeles?
That's something that I debunk in the Manson File. Ed Sanders pretty much created that idea out of whole cloth from listening to malicious rumors from people in that branch of the OTO. But
he was sued by the Process and subsequent printings of that book had to have those chapters removed.
Yes, and
but I didn't know if the OTO was the same case as
Solar Lodge sued him too, and most of what Sanders did, write some things that were true. He did, like Tom O'Neill, a monkey with a typewriter. Some of their research is actually useful and good, but Sanders erred by assuming that there was this occult influence on Manson and on the crimes, which was his way of distancing the counterculture and the hippie movement from Manson and trying to make him look like some kind of satanic freak,
But
that was not.
wasn't there an influence on his philosophy, whether it was Scientology or, yeah, and all of these things do kind of draw on each other.
Mhm.
Scientology drew on Golden Dawn, OTO. Wasn't
Right.
there some influence on his
No,
philosophy?
Charlie was very influenced by Scientology. In Terminal Island, a fellow prisoner of his who was in a cell with him learned a little bit about Dianetics and made himself into like an amateur auditor. And for a while, Charlie did identify himself on the prison records, his religion, as Scientologist. He definitely was influenced by Scientology ideas, but he never became a Scientologist. But even at the end of his life, he still used occasionally Scientology phrases like mocked up, postulate, that sort of thing. So he was influenced by Hubbard. He was not influenced by Crowley. He absolutely had no respect for Crowley whatsoever, or any kind of Western occultism.
Mhm. Mhm. What do you think Crowley's role was with, the little we know about his interaction with British intelligence? I mean, we also know that I believe Theodore Royce and Kellner, some of the original OTO founders, that they were involved with British
Mhm.
intelligence as well.
Right.
What do you make of that?
I know for a fact Crowley was used by British intelligence. Again, and I think it's important you point out the difference between an asset and an agent.
Hmm.
Crowley, when he was in New York, was used to, as I mentioned, he would spread ridiculous pro-German propaganda to make Germany look bad. He was sort of, because of his bad reputation, it was like if Aleister Crowley supports Germany, that was like a false flag
Sure.
operation on a very mild. So he
But
was a
you're
patriot.
admitting that they do these kinds of things. I feel like sometimes you say that that's something that they would never do, that false
No,
flags
I
or what.
never. No, no. Let me get this
I'm
straight.
not trying to generalize what you're
No,
saying. I'm just.
no. Here, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. Is the problem here? False flag operations happen.
Mhm.
They don't happen on the gigantic scale of every fucking school shooting
Yeah.
being a false flag operation. They don't, and also a false flag operation is limited to a small number of people who know what it is. Many of them fail. Usually the other side intelligence agency says this is a false flag operation and proves it. Throughout history, of course, have military strategists used the false flag method? Of course they have. Is it happening every day? Is every single thing that happens in the news a false flag operation? The problem is ignorant people hear this phrase, and in the echo chamber of their little conspiracy theory world, they think every damn thing that happens is a false flag
Mhm.
operation. So,
Mhm.
yeah, intelligence agencies plant ideas to make their enemy look bad. Of course they do.
Mhm.
That's what intelligence agencies do.
Mhm.
And Crowley knew Dennis Wheatley, for example. Dennis Wheatley was absolutely connected to British intelligence.
Right.
Christopher Lee, who had some marginal connection, less than he is believed to have, he sort of mythologized that, but he did know Dennis Wheatley very well. And he told me that Dennis Wheatley had interviewed Crowley when Rudolf Hess came to England to ask about the German occult world and what sort of ideas, because Crowley had lived in Berlin, what sort of occult esoteric ideas Hess might have, so that
Mhm.
British intelligence could interview him. So there definitely was, Crowley was willing to cooperate
Mhm.
with British intelligence, but
Mhm.
was he an agent? No.
Mhm. Mhm. Um, I know that you don't believe, for the most part, the whole CIA created or kind of manufactured the hippies. Timothy Leary, later in his life, was pretty candid talking about how, they were behind a lot of his moves. He said that, he gives them full credit for the
But
sponsorship and initiation of the counterculture. What purpose was the CIA using Leary then to do, to
I
proliferate LSD?
actually, I knew Leary too. I met Leary in 1976, and I knew him pretty well in the 80s, and his
Mhm.
entourage of so-called alchemists that were experimenting with new psychedelic drugs. I would argue Leary is the proof that was not the CIA was creating the counterculture. They were using people like Leary to discredit it, to destroy it, and to mislead. Actually, what the CIA is generally liberal in its beliefs and tolerant.
Mhm.
I think a lot of people think that the CIA is like the FBI or like J. Edgar Hoover. The CIA generally, because it's cosmopolitan, well-traveled, and worldly, was not conservative for the most part. It was actually quite liberal. It
Mhm.
did not have a problem with the counterculture because the counterculture could be said to show to the Soviet Union and to the Iron Curtain, we have freedom, we allow dissent. What the CIA didn't want is anything leading to communism or Marxism or actually revolutionary ideas.
Mhm.
I have no doubt that Timothy Leary, again, was an asset. His boss at Harvard definitely worked for the OSS, the predecessor to the CIA, and they supervised and watched his experiments with LSD.
Mhm.
And and Leary spoke openly about praising the CIA to me and to many other people. And his exploits in Algiers are extremely suspicious. It seems like he was sent there to infiltrate the Black Panther Party and to defeat any revolutionary activity. So rather than that the counterculture was created by the CIA naturally watched as young people started using LSD, which they thought would be a truth serum and a mind control agent. When young people in Haight Ashbury started using it for mind expansion, they studied it, they looked at it, they
But
observed it.
that LSD was originally put out into the populace by the CIA and their assets, like Leary. So isn't that exactly what you're saying, that they used people like him and LSD experimentation
Well,
as a way to break up the
CIA was
counterculture?
when LSD was illegalized in 1966, they tried to stop the distribution of it altogether. It was outlaw acid makers like Owsley
Mhm.
and Scully and other people like that, working through the Grateful Dead and other rock
Mhm.
bands. They made better LSD, Orange Sunshine, and that
Mhm.
sort of thing than the Sandoz brand. So
Mhm.
I've looked into the whole LSD thing too. So I want to basically, this is right wing propaganda. The
Which part
idea
of it specifically?
the idea that the counterculture was not real, that there was no actual spontaneous youth revolution against
Mhm.
war, for it is basically discrediting the revolutionary spirit of the
Mhm.
60s and saying
Yeah.
that's not real. It was created by the deep state. It is a plank of right-wing propaganda.
I'm sure that some people do think that what you're saying, but I think the more, you know, more acknowledged consensus nowadays is that that revolution and that youth movement and the anti-war movement were very real and very authentic. And it's for that exact reason that the government felt they had to go in and break it up and use things like
Absolutely.
Leary and LSD to
Right.
distract and just completely
Well,
neutralize it.
absolutely.
I
Yes.
think
Leary
that's what
was.
more people think at this point, rather than that they just made the whole thing, is that there was this very powerful
Well,
contingency of
some
youth.
people, I mean, I encounter it all the time. This idea that every rock band, everything that ever happened in the 60s was some sort of engineered a psyop. I mean, come on, people think Taylor Swift is a psyop and that
You're her
Xena
dad, right?
her biological parents. And this is, it is when I hear these things, I know because these things have been applied to me, and I've heard every kind of ridiculous rumor and
Mhm.
conspiracy directed to me. And I
Mhm.
know they're not true, but
Mhm.
that doesn't matter, about how
It,
my ear was cut off. These people have
right.
theories about that.
People care
So
about what's sensationalistic. I agree. But things like you brought up rock bands, absolutely not all of them were, but I feel like there are good cases to be made that some were maybe at least hijacked or utilized. People took Malcolm McLaren kind of helping manufacture early punk. You have the Copeland brothers and Miles Copeland,
well,
being
well, just
one of the
okay.
founders of the CIA.
But just because of what makes you think that what is it in any of the police music that has some kind of social significance that the CIA would want?
I don't know
Saying
that there's any specific, like, there's a really, really interesting interview with Miles Copeland Sr., where an interviewer's asking him kind of about his time with this OSS and the CIA. And
right,
he asked them that exact question you just did. He asked, what was the purpose of this? Like, what advantage could it give you? And Miles Copeland's For listeners who don't know who he is, he's the father of Stuart Copeland, who
Right.
was the founder of the Police.
Mm.
And his response to that question was, the next time you're at a Police concert and you see an audience of 20,000 minds open for whatever message we're ready to put in, that'll answer your question. That's not verbatim, but that's pretty much the gist of his answer. Another example would be if you've heard of the band Killing Joke, who
Yeah,
was kind of that British early punk
I
new
know. I
wave.
know.
Jazz Coleman, the lead singer, he's in the last few years, he's given some pretty interesting interviews where he talks very candidly about the fact that Killing Joke was quite literally conceived in a boardroom of the Tavistock Institute. Whether or not he's kind of embellishing or making things up, I find it an interesting, admission from someone like him, who was part again of this scene that kind of had a bend
Well,
of the
again,
esoteric.
as far as I'm concerned, that is right-wing propaganda that is saying it's exactly, people believe Taylor Swift is a psyop.
Mhm, mhm.
Do you believe that?
Of course not. I don't
Why?
believe that she's a psyop, but I also believe that if someone wanted to use a person that has a platform of that size,
But
they
for
would
what?
attempt to. Maybe they couldn't. Maybe they couldn't pull it off.
How did Killing Joke succeed in the Tavistock
I
Institute
I
plan?
don't know, but those are just two examples coming from the mouths of those people saying
I
that
think that is total bullshit.
it
And
very
I
well
don't
may
think that
be.
Miles Copeland would say that. Because
I'll send you the interview after we talk. You can
I
decide for yourself.
my relatives were all involved in the military. One of
Mhm.
my relatives was involved in the Defense Intelligence Agency. So yeah, you're right. We're all musicians. We're given orders by our intelligence agent controllers. It's bullshit,
I don't
you know.
believe that. I don't, but I
Right.
do think that it's possible that some were, and that some
And when I
institutions.
see proof of it, I will agree with you. I don't see any proof that it's true. And I don't think anybody's in control of anything at this
Yeah,
point. It would be better if someone was.
I
We
tend
are
to agree with you.
careening, we are careening over a cliff with nobody at the wheel. And I think people are grasping at these theories to hope that there's someone who can
Mhm,
put the brakes on or can
mhm,
steer it anyway.
mhm.
I believe we are headed towards total catastrophe and there's nobody in charge. And this infantile belief that some huge paternal figure is controlling everything,
Mhm.
everything is fake news and a false flag, and this didn't really happen, that didn't really happen, so and so didn't really die. All of this is a desperate paranoid effort to to take control over sheer chaos.
And I agree
That's
for the
my
most part,
ultimate.
it does cause just more paranoia and harm than any good. And for the most part, you're right. Probably 90% of those things are, complete fabrications and bullshit. I just feel like there are some aspects of these things that some people will write off more easily than others. As like you say, there's nobody that's in charge. There's definitely not one person in charge, but there's definitely competing
Well,
factions and
somebody being
that are
related to
vying for
someone
it.
in the CIA, which is a huge organization, doesn't prove anything to
Hmm.
me. And
Hmm.
there's the implication that Miles Copeland somehow is involved with some sinister activity. Should there not be intelligence agencies? I mean, I don't support Julian Assange. I don't support people like that who I see as essentially traitors who betrayed people who were just doing their job and probably led to their death. What do these people want? There to be no intelligence agencies? And
I think that the government and I just think there's been so much corruption that people have lost complete faith in the institution as a whole. And you
absolutely
can't discredit or you can't fault them for feeling that way because we
right.
have been completely let down and betrayed. And I
Sure.
think that the institutions are corrupted to a point where,
Right.
nothing's impossible, nothing's beyond.
Well, since the JFK assassination and then followed up about 10 years later by Watergate, the United States public has had absolutely no faith
Mhm,
in the official narratives of the government, obviously.
mhm.
But it's led to really like a kind of mass paranoid schizophrenia where legitimate doubt of authority has become full-blown mania.
Mhm.
That's the problem. And
Yeah,
I think it's dangerous to continue to say, well, it's an interesting theory. Yes, that becomes a kind of entertainment. If we
it
don't have
does.
proof, if we don't have evidence of any kind, then you have to use Occam's razor and say it's probably not true. And I do think there's no hope to control this conspiracy madness. I made an effort to try to do so, and it failed completely because I underestimated the degree how many millions of people believe absolute nonsense, don't know anything about science, don't know anything about history, don't know anything about how government or the military actually works, as opposed to their comic book fantasy of how it works.
And like you
And
said yourself, anything you can say to try to defend, like the things that you'll say, people just turn it against you and say, well, of course that's what you would say, if you're probably a part of it.
So
It's
I
kind of,
want
is
to
no
say
hope.
that I don't have the least bit of hope or optimism that any rational explanation will stop this. I think it's going to continue to get worse as people are lost in their old algorithm bubble of misinformation, and they only know other people who are equally hysterical and panicky, and they're frightened. They're frightened because our civilization is falling apart, and they're looking for black and white solid answers that the evil they are making this happen. And I wrote a song about it, The Nice People, which is basically a critique of the left-wing woke ideas of conspiracy, and another one called They, which is about the right-wing conspiracy. And I put them as a double feature video because I believe both extremes are totally wrong. They are assuming that some figure or some group or shadowy organization in a boardroom is making these things happen. And they refuse to accept that things are just falling apart, and that the world as we know it is actually ending. Civilization is falling apart, and there's nobody to turn to. There is no specter. There is no powerful criminal, super organization making these things happen.
Well, Nick, I really appreciate you taking the time to join me tonight and talk about these things. I've really enjoyed talking about it, and I appreciate your very unique perspective on all these topics. So
My
thanks.
pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me, and I enjoyed our discussion as well.
Thanks. Take care.